People often underestimate the weight of their suffering. They think pain is pointless, but that's a lie, a deeply dangerous one. The truth is, your suffering might just be the loudest message the universe has ever spoken into someone else's life. You didn't come into that narcissist world by accident. You were sent with your compassion, your boundaries, your refusal to break. You were the final opportunity they had to confront the monster within themselves. You were not chosen by chance. You were placed with purpose. And the sooner you understand that, the more power you'll reclaim from the chaos you were thrown into. People often stumble through life, believing that everything happening around them is random, that the pain, the betrayal, the emotional manipulation, it's all just some twisted lottery they happen to lose. But that's a naive and superficial way to interpret your suffering. Because suffering, especially the kind that arises from a deeply toxic dynamic, particularly with someone narcissistic, is rarely meaningless. It is heavy. It is structured. It serves a purpose, if not for the one who inflicts it, then for the one who endures it. When you walked into that person's life, you didn't come as a blank slate. You came with a heart capable of love, grace, and seeing the best in others. And that's what made you dangerous to them. Not because you had some power they wanted to possess, although they might have convinced you of that at first, but because you carried something sacred, the reflection of what they were not. The presence of someone authentic is often the most agonizing thing for someone deeply inauthentic. And so the friction began, not because you did something wrong, but because who you were challenged, who they refused to become. There is something profoundly spiritual about being sent into darkness with light in your hands. Whether you realize it or not, you were sent not for punishment, but for purpose. You see, narcissists do not respond to kindness the way healthy people do. They see kindness as weakness. They interpret empathy as naivety. But beneath all their arrogance, there's a hollow echo of fear. They know deep within themselves that they are losing touch with humanity. And when someone walks into their life, radiating what they've spent years denying, it shakes them, it threatens them, it exposes them. This is why your presence triggered so much chaos. Not because you were broken, but because you were whole. Not because you were weak, but because you were willing to hold the line when they crossed it. And that is where the deeper meaning of all this begins to unfold. You weren't just another person they could manipulate. You were the mirror. You were the interruption. The one who didn't flinch when they pushed. The one who stayed rooted while they tried to uproot everything sacred. Make no mistake, that resistance was not random. That strength was not accidental. It was forged, sometimes over years, sometimes through tears, sometimes in silence, but it was there, and it was used. There are moments in life when you become the very thing that forces someone to choose, to finally confront the reality of who they are, or to destroy anything that reminds them of it. And narcissists, more often than not, choose destruction. They don't want to change. They want to control. And when control is no longer possible, they escalate, slandering, twisting narratives. But that choice they made to reject you, to harm you, to sabotage something that was offered in sincerity, that choice is on them. Your presence didn't make them worse. It revealed who they were already becoming. You weren't placed in their life to fix them. That's not your responsibility. You were placed there as a final opportunity, a final lesson, a divine checkmate. And the tragedy is not that they lost you. The tragedy is that they lost the last person willing to love them honestly. You may have thought you were just trying to help, support, or love them through their brokenness. But in reality, you were standing at the edge of their self-destruction, waving the last red flag before the fall, And that flag wasn't made of rage or revenge. It was made of truth, of love with boundaries, of compassion that doesn't fold to abuse. The placement of your soul in that dynamic was not a mistake. And that's why the experience left such a deep mark. It was spiritual warfare, a battle not just of personalities, but of principles. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about who would rise and who would remain chained. You were sent as a witness, a symbol, a final call to transformation. Whether they answered that call or not has nothing to do with your value. Your presence was the signal. Your exit was the consequence. And everything in between was the space for repentance they never claimed. Your empathy was the mirror meant to expose their darkness. And that's the piece most people overlook when they find themselves entangled with a narcissist. It's easy to look back and blame yourself for caring too much, for being too available, too forgiving, too loyal. But those traits weren't flaws. They were evidence of your depth, your integrity, your humanity. In a world where people armor themselves with indifference and emotional distance, your willingness to feel, to truly feel, was disruptive to someone who had long abandoned that part of themselves. The narcissist doesn't fear confrontation as much as they fear reflection. They don't fear arguments. They thrive in them. What terrifies them is the quiet presence of someone who sees through the performance. Someone who isn't seduced by the facade. Someone who listens, not just to what is said, but to what is not. That's what your empathy did. It stripped away their illusions. It held up an emotional mirror, not through criticism or conflict, but through consistency, presence, compassion. You didn't need to expose them with your words. Your spirit did it on its own. And that's why they began to distort the dynamic. That's why you were slowly made to feel like the villain, the unstable one, the overreactor, because you weren't playing the role they needed you to play. They wanted a reflection that flattered them, not one that confronted them. But your empathy was not shallow. It was real. It noticed things. It picked up on contradictions. It remembered how they spoke on day 1 versus day 30. It saw through the charm, through the shifts, through the mask, and instead of echoing back admiration, it echoed back truth. And truth is devastating to someone built on lies. Narcissists construct identities like fortresses. They gather compliments, attention, success stories, and use them as bricks to build an image. But your empathy didn't worship the image. It sought the person. It looked deeper. And when it couldn't find consistency, when it found manipulation instead of honesty, wounds instead of depth, fear instead of courage, it didn't turn away, at least not immediately. It leaned in. And that's when the war began. Because to a narcissist, empathy isn't compassion. It's a threat. It's the thing that sees what they've hidden. And once seen, their power begins to unravel. That's the strange paradox. Your greatest gift was also what triggered their defenses the most. You didn't come with judgment or control. You came with understanding. Yet that understanding didn't feel safe to them because it saw everything: the mask, the insecurity, the rage, the emptiness. And instead of validating their fantasy, your empathy exposed the void they refused to acknowledge. That's the kind of confrontation a narcissist cannot tolerate, being truly known. So they fought back, not through honesty, but through distortion. They rewrote the story. They needed to make you the unstable one. They needed to redefine your empathy as weakness, naivety, or dysfunction, because if they didn't, they would have to face the truth. Your presence made obvious that something inside them was deeply broken. But instead of facing that, they tried to break you. In their mind, if they could silence the mirror, they could escape the reflection. But the truth doesn't disappear just because someone refuses to face it. It lingers, it echoes, it burns in silence. You weren't too emotional, you weren't too sensitive, you were accurate. Your emotional intelligence was perceiving the spiritual rot they spent years trying to cover. Every time you responded with concern, with boundaries, with confusion, they felt exposed. Not because you were doing something wrong, but because you were seeing something real. That's what empathy does. It discerns, it penetrates, it recognizes not just behavior, but motive. And when it finds contradiction, it doesn't recoil. It questions. And those questions are unbearable. To someone whose identity depends on deception, what they wanted was admiration. What they got was honesty. What they demanded was obedience. What they encountered was courage. And that's what made you the mirror. Not because you tried to fix them or save them, but because your presence made denial impossible. They couldn't keep pretending to be a hero in front of someone who saw the damage. They couldn't play the victim when your heart didn't buy the act. You made the lie harder to believe, even for them. That's why they tried to erase you, because they couldn't erase what your empathy revealed. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are divine resistance. The moment you draw a line, especially in the face of manipulation and emotional chaos, you are not harming anyone. You are affirming your worth. That's something narcissists cannot stand. Not because you're doing anything objectively wrong, but because your refusal to bend threatens their control. Boundaries interrupt the narcissist's fantasy of superiority and entitlement. They signal that their behavior is no longer tolerated. And that in itself is a profound act of spiritual rebellion against manipulation. For someone who has built their identity around dominance and deceit, your boundary isn't seen as a healthy limit. It's seen as rejection, rebellion, or betrayal. But what you're really doing is preserving your integrity. You're saying this far and no further. You're refusing to be complicit in your own destruction. That's not cruelty, that's clarity. And that clarity doesn't come from anger. It comes from truth. It comes from an awakening, a deep realization. You were not put on this earth to be someone's emotional punching bag, to be guilted into submission, or to be trained to tolerate disrespect just to keep the peace. You weren't unkind when you stopped explaining yourself. You weren't selfish when you chose silence over chaos. You weren't unfair when you walked away instead of arguing endlessly with someone committed to misunderstanding you. These actions may have looked cold to someone who benefited from your warmth, but they were acts of survival. They were acts of reclaiming the space that had been slowly overtaken by someone else's needs, moods, and insecurities. Every boundary you placed was a return to yourself, a declaration that your voice, your time, and your peace matter. And that's why boundaries are spiritual, because they protect not just your mind, but your soul. They are an act of resistance against the forces that seek to dismantle your identity. They are the armor of the emotionally conscious. And when you finally draw them, especially after being conditioned to feel guilty for doing so, you step into a strength that cannot be manipulated. You step into the authority of someone who knows their value, who no longer derives self-worth from how well they tolerate dysfunction, but from how clearly they can discern what's healthy and what's not. The narcissist sees boundaries as threats because they rely on blurred lines. They thrive where roles are undefined, where guilt and obligation can be weaponized, where your compassion can be turned against you. A boundary removes that power. It creates distance. It forces accountability. It says, I am not afraid to disappoint you if it means protecting myself. And that statement, even when made silently, challenges the entire power structure they've tried to build around your compliance. What most people don't realize is that the moment you say no to a narcissist, truly say it, not with fear or shame, but with conviction, you're no longer playing the role they wrote for you. You've stepped off their stage. And when that happens, They either escalate or vanish, not because you were unkind, but because you became uncontrollable. Your kindness was only valuable to them when it came without limits. Your love was only celebrated when it didn't require accountability. The moment you made it conditional on respect, it became a problem for them, not because your conditions were unreasonable, but because their behavior was you didn't place boundaries to punish. You placed boundaries to protect yourself. That difference is critical. You weren't trying to harm. You were trying to heal, but healing cannot happen in an environment of repeated disrespect. And when they refused to change, dismissed your needs, or mocked your reality, you faced a choice: sacrifice your well-being or step into the unknown with your dignity intact. And that choice, that terrifying, liberating, world-altering choice, was the turning point. You didn't draw boundaries because you stopped caring. You drew boundaries because you finally started caring about yourself. And the fallout that followed, the backlash, the accusations, the isolation, all of it was evidence that you had finally disrupted the cycle. You had finally said enough and meant it, not as a threat or an ultimatum, but as a sacred declaration. Your soul was no longer available for exploitation. That is not cruelty. That is sacred defiance. That is truth in motion. That is what it means to love yourself in the face of persistent disrespect. The narcissist's rejection of you was a rejection of truth itself. It's tempting to internalize that rejection, to see it as a commentary on your worth, your effort, your character, but that is a distortion crafted by someone who has spent their life running from reality. When someone who thrives on illusion and control begins to feel exposed by the presence of someone authentic, they will eventually reach a breaking point. That breaking point isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's slow and subtle, a distancing, a devaluing, a calculated withdrawal of affection and attention. Other times, it's sudden, cruel, and confusing. Either way, it isn't your truth they accept or embrace. It's your presence they push away, because it reminds them of everything they are unwilling to face within themselves. Rejection from a narcissist isn't about your being unworthy. It's about their being unwilling to grow, to evolve, to be held accountable. You did not bring chaos. You brought order to a life built on manipulation. You brought stability to someone who only feels powerful in confusion. You brought honesty to someone who survives through deceit. And when that kind of truth walks into their life, the narcissist doesn't feel safe. They feel threatened. Not because you threatened them, but because your authenticity made it harder for them to continue pretending. The rejection you experienced wasn't personal, even though it felt deeply personal. It felt like betrayal because it was. It felt like abandonment because it was. But underneath all that pain is a deeper understanding their rejection was a survival tactic. They needed to preserve their false self. And the only way to do that was to remove anything that could expose the cracks. You simply by existing in truth were exposing those cracks. You were the light revealing the mold. And when mold is exposed to light, it cannot survive. This is why they often flip the script. They rewrite the story. They frame your boundaries as cruelty. They label your honesty as instability. They attack your credibility because your credibility was the one thing that could destroy the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. And so they discard you, distance themselves from the very person who offered them the most sincere connection. Not because you were flawed, but because you were real. And real is terrifying to someone who has spent years hiding behind a mask. Your presence created an inner conflict, the pull toward healing versus the fear of being truly seen. And more often than not, the fear wins, because healing requires humility, and humility demands truth. To accept your presence fully They would have had to admit to themselves that the version of them you saw, the one behind the charm, behind the bravado, was real. That the emptiness you felt wasn't in your mind. That the emotional games weren't misunderstandings. That the harm wasn't unintentional. And facing that would require a level of courage they never cultivated. So instead of rising to meet the truth, they pushed it away. They rejected you, not because you were too much, but because you were too accurate. And accuracy is dangerous in a world of denial. You were the embodiment of everything they feared, not because you were cruel or controlling, but because you couldn't be deceived. You didn't buy into their fantasy. You questioned it. You stood firm in your convictions. And they realized they couldn't manipulate you the way they manipulated others. They couldn't keep the mask on in front of you. So the only option was to exile you from their world. But here's what truly matters. Their rejection wasn't a verdict on your identity. It was a confession about their own. When someone cannot accept truth, they will always reject the people who carry it. They will always push away those who live in alignment with values they've abandoned. That rejection isn't failure. It's clarity. It's a confirmation that you were walking in a different direction toward wholeness while they were committed to maintaining their wounds. And when paths like that intersect, there is always friction. That friction culminates in a choice. They chose comfort over truth, control over connection, image over intimacy. And the fact that you stood in your truth, even when it cost you the connection, is not something to regret. It's something to honor, because you didn't betray yourself to keep their world intact. You didn't sacrifice your soul to be accepted by someone who feared their own. You stood where few do, in the center of truth, knowing it might cost everything, but willing to pay that price rather than become another puppet in their game of deception. Your endurance was a final act of mercy. They failed to heed what you gave, what you tolerated, what you held together in silence. None of it was weakness. It was a rare kind of strength that comes from the deepest parts of the human spirit. You endured not because you didn't see what was happening, but because you hoped. You hoped they would change. You believed in potential. You held out grace longer than anyone else would have. You kept showing up even after your presence was taken for granted. You offered understanding even after misunderstanding was weaponized against you. That kind of endurance isn't foolishness. It's conviction. It's faith in the possibility that love could still reach someone who was slowly closing themselves off from it. And that sips where the tragedy lies, because your endurance was accepted just emotional resilience. It was spiritual offering. It was mercy extended beyond what was deserved. It was your soul saying, I see your brokenness and I step still here. Most people run when they see the signs, but you stayed, not because you lacked options, but because you had compassion. You weren't blind to the manipulation. You weren't naive to the shifts in behavior. You weren't unaware of the gaslighting, the cycles, the strange silences followed by love bombing and confusion. You saw it all. But still, you didn't walk away immediately. You gave them more time. You gave them more chances. You waited, perhaps praying that something in them would soften, that something buried deep might respond to the authenticity you were offering. But narcissists don't respond to endurance with gratitude. They interpret it as permission. Every time you forgave, they assumed they had more room. Every time you de-escalated conflict, they saw it as proof that you wouldn't leave. Every time you showed restraint, they believed they had the upper hand. And still, you stayed. Not because you lacked boundaries, but because you were trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. You were trying to show them something different from what the world had shown them. You were trying to be the person they claimed they never had. Your endurance was a message. There's still time to turn this around. There's still time to stop playing the game and start facing the truth. There's a way to rebuild what has been broken, but they didn't hear it, or rather, they chose not to, because mercy terrifies the narcissist more than judgment. Judgment is expected, condemnation fits their internal narrative, but mercy disrupts the identity they've created, the story where they're always the victim or the hero, never the villain. So instead of responding with humility, they escalate, they test your patience, they harden. Because admitting they were wrong would mean admitting you were right. And their pride is too fragile for that. Even as you began to draw lines, even as you started to reclaim your space, you didn't do it with rage. You did it with sorrow. You didn't leave with bitterness. You left with disappointment. Because deep down, part of you still wanted to believe in the redemption of that connection. Maybe, just maybe, your endurance would finally open their eyes, that the consistency, the presence, the grace you offered would become undeniable. But it didn't. Not because it wasn't powerful, but because they weren't willing. They saw the line in the sand, and instead of stepping toward reconciliation, they crossed it again. And this is the moment that breaks most people. The realization that even your most sincere efforts were rejected, not because they weren't good enough, but because the person you gave them to didn't want to grow. Your endurance, instead of waking them up, became something they stepped over on their way to further destruction. But that's not your failure. It's not a sign you should have done more. It's evidence that no amount of mercy can save someone who refuses to look at themselves honestly. You gave them time. You gave them presence. You gave silence when it would have been easier to yell. You gave understanding when they didn't deserve it. That wasn't for nothing. That was your character on full display. That was your soul doing everything it could to pull another soul back from the edge. And what they did with that grace is not yours to carry. God doesn't waste pain. He turns it into a warning and a weapon. Every tear you shed, every moment you questioned your worth, every sleepless night filled with confusion and exhaustion, none of it vanished into the void. What you walked through was not just suffering, it was refinement. It was the kind of trial that doesn't just bruise the surface, but digs deep into the soul, breaking apart illusions, dependencies, and the lies you believed about yourself. And while it may have felt like you were being torn apart, something was also being built inside you. Something stronger, wiser, sharper. Pain like that doesn't leave you the same. It remakes you, it reshapes how you see, how you discern, how you respond to the world around you. The narcissist thought they were simply draining you, using you, manipulating you for their own convenience, but what they didn't see and what they still might not understand is that in trying to break you, they triggered something sacred. They activated a fire they couldn't control, becoming the very forge that God used to bring out a version of you they never expected to meet. And that's why your story doesn't end in defeat, because what was meant to destroy you is now the very evidence of what God can do with a broken heart surrendered to his process. Pain in the hands of the divine becomes purpose. The chaos they caused became your greatest curriculum. The betrayal, your blueprint for better boundaries. The gaslighting, your sharpened ability to see through manipulation. The emotional starvation, your lesson in feeding yourself from within. And most importantly, the experience taught you to listen to the voice you had been trained to ignore your own. That voice that told you something was off. That internal alarm that was silenced too many times in the name of love, loyalty, or fear of loss. God didn't let those alarms ring without reason. They were warnings, not just for you, but through you. You became a walking signal, not just a person in pain, but a living warning to the narcissist. Their time for control is running out. That the damage they cause does not go unnoticed forever. That the people they try to keep beneath them will not stay there. That truth rises, even if it has to crawl through ashes to do so. And when you walked away or stood firm, or refused to let them rewrite your reality, that wasn't just a moment of human defiance, it was spiritual resistance. It was heaven saying, enough. It was the echo of justice where injustice had ruled for too long. The narcissist may never acknowledge this. They may continue to smear, distort, or pretend they were the victim all along. But even if they never say it aloud, they felt the shift. They felt the power they once had over you break. They felt the silence of your absence ring louder than all their manipulations combined. They felt the loss of control, not just over your actions, but over your beliefs about yourself. And whether they admit it or not, your strength was a warning to them, a final unspoken message that grace has limits and truth has consequences. But it doesn't stop there, because the pain you endured also became a weapon, not of vengeance, but of wisdom. You now carry something you didn't have before, discernment that can't be faked, a depth of understanding about human behavior, about spiritual warfare, about psychological patterns that textbooks can't teach. And that knowledge, that strength, that healing becomes something you carry into every future relationship, every boundary, every decision. You don't walk blindly anymore. You see, and you see with clarity forged through fire. That clarity protects not only you, but others. Your story becomes a warning for those still entangled, still confused, still believing they are the problem. Your survival speaks for them when they have no words. Your healing gives them hope that they're not crazy, that they're not alone, and that there is life on the other side of manipulation. God didn't waste your pain. He weaponized it, not to destroy, but to defend, not to retaliate, but to redeem. Every time you speak truth, every time you validate your own voice, every time you stand tall when the past tries to pull you back down, you are wielding the very thing that once wounded you. That is divine strategy. That is justice in motion. That is the transformation of suffering into strength, responsibility. That word isn't just a moral obligation. It's the foundation upon which meaning is built. And when people abandon responsibility, shrug it off because it's inconvenient or painful, or simply because they're tired, something insidious begins to happen. The soul decays, the chaos of life, once held at bay by structure and discipline, seeps in. And it doesn't stay neutral. It grows. It ferments. It morphs into something destructive. We start to lie more. We procrastinate. We blame. We envy. We shrink from challenges that would have made us stronger. When you neglect your responsibilities, especially those small daily acts that sustain your life and relationships, you don't just let things slide. You begin to cultivate a deep, often unspoken contempt for yourself. This isn't necessarily obvious at first. You tell yourself you're just tired or that things aren't that serious. Maybe you even convince yourself that others are to blame for your current situation. But underneath all that rationalization, something darker is growing. The part of you that knows what you should be doing, that watches as you avoid cleaning your room, showing up on time, finishing the project, making the apology, that part doesn't stay silent. It keeps score. And as the days go by, the weight of all the things you've left undone begins to pile up, not just in your external world, but within you. The human psyche isn't built to live in perpetual avoidance. We are wired to act, to carry burdens, to impose structure on the world. When we fail to do that, when we stop fulfilling our duties, we begin to fracture internally. You start to lose trust in yourself. Every time you say, I'll do it tomorrow, and you don't, something inside you breaks a little more. And that break accumulates. The mess in your room becomes the mess in your mind. The chaos outside mirrors the chaos inside. You feel unworthy, even if you don't know why. You walk through your days with a subtle heaviness, a background hum of inadequacy, because deep down, you know you've abandoned your post. And that's the dangerous part. This self-contempt doesn't manifest as a dramatic breakdown. It shows up in subtle, corrosive ways. You stop looking people in the eye, slouch, avoid mirrors, drown yourself in distractions, scrolling endlessly, binge-watching, eating, drinking, anything to avoid the quiet moments when that inner voice might speak up and remind you of the truth you've been running from. You tell yourself you're just taking it easy, but really you're hiding from the responsibility that gives your life structure and from the standards you once held yourself to. Even worse, over time, you begin to believe you deserve the discomfort you feel, that this version of you, the one who avoids, delays, and lets others down, is the real you. And that's when despair sets in. Because once you start identifying with your failure to act, you stop believing in your capacity to change. That's when people spiral. That's when nihilism takes root. When they stop seeing themselves as someone who could be better and start believing they are meant to fail, that's how the soul corrodes. Not all at once, but through daily, quiet betrayals of what you know to be right. Procrastination isn't just a time management issue, it's a form of self-sabotage. And worse, it's a silent betrayal of your potential. Every time you delay what you know you should do, you're not just avoiding a task, you're actively stepping away from the version of yourself you could become. That's a serious matter. People underestimate what's at stake when they say, "I'll do it later," because embedded in that statement is the belief that the future will be more stable, more motivated, or more prepared than the present. But there's no better time to act than now. And every time you avoid that truth, you erode your strength. Procrastination feeds on fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of the responsibility that might follow success. People say they're lazy, but laziness often masks deeper, more painful emotions. If you don't try, you can't fail. If you don't finish, you can't be criticized. If you stay stuck, you don't have to risk growth. That seems safe on the surface, but what it really creates is stagnation. And in that state, your potential begins to decay. Not because you're incapable, but because you refuse to engage with the challenge. Unused potential becomes a weight, and the longer it's avoided, the heavier it gets. The most dangerous thing about procrastination, it's quiet. It doesn't scream at you. It whispers. It offers comfort. It tells you, you've got time. It seduces you into thinking waiting doesn't carry a cost. But time doesn't wait. The cost is real. And you pay it in missed opportunities, diminished confidence, and the slow withering of your belief that you can get things done. You tell yourself you're waiting for the right moment, for motivation to strike. But motivation doesn't come before action. It comes from it. Yet you keep waiting. You keep putting off what matters, hoping by some miracle that you'll wake up one day ready to conquer the world. But that day doesn't arrive. Instead, the habit of avoidance deepens and the fear that drives it grows stronger. Eventually, you begin to distrust yourself. You recognize your patterns, you see the cycle, and with every repetition, you believe a little less in your ability to break free. That disbelief becomes internalized. You start to label yourself. I'm a procrastinator. I'm lazy. I'm undisciplined. But that's not who you are. That's what happens when fear dictates your behavior and you refuse to confront it. You're not just putting off tasks. You're postponing the life you could be living. And the longer you wait, the more distant that life becomes, until it no longer feels like a possibility at all. Think for a second about what happens when you abandon responsibility. You surrender the only path that leads to genuine self-improvement, and instead, you pick up a far more destructive companion, blame. Blame is the refuge of the unaccountable. It's the mechanism by which you avoid facing your shortcomings, failures, and refusal to bear life's burdens. When something goes wrong, a relationship falters, a project collapses, your health declines. You look outward, you point at circumstances, other people, systemic forces. You become a victim of your environment rather than an agent capable of change. And every time you shift that burden onto someone or something else, you forfeit a precious opportunity to learn, adjust, and grow. Blame feels comforting because it maintains an illusion of moral superiority. If you're not responsible, you can't be at fault. You sanctify your suffering. It wasn't my procrastination that robbed me of success. It was the unfair boss who wouldn't give me credit. It wasn't my unwillingness to negotiate. It was market unpredictability. That narrative spares you the bitterness of self-confrontation, but also erodes your capacity to change. Growth demands that you examine your own role in the fiasco, hold yourself to a standard, and then take corrective action. Blame deprives you of that process by transforming you into an observer rather than a participant in your own life. What's more, blame infects your relationships. Those around you start to see you not as someone striving for improvement, but as someone perpetually offended. They learn to avoid bringing up issues because every critique is met with a litany of justifications. If only you had, if the system were fair, I would have all designed to deflect responsibility. Over time, you cultivate a social environment that mirrors your inner world, one where accountability is taboo and growth is replaced by grievance. You surround yourself with nods rather than constructive feedback, and because you never truly engage with what's wrong, you never truly get better. This habit of blame also distorts reality. You start to perceive threats and conspiracies where none exist. Every suggestion becomes a personal attack. Every obstacle, an intentional slight. Paranoia grows in the fertile soil of victimhood. And instead of resilience, you become timid, reactive, defensive. Life's challenges cease to be tests of character and become evidence of your undoing. In that mindset, there is no learning, only resistance. Worst of all, the habit of blame is self-reinforcing. It begins as a convenient escape hatch, but soon becomes your default mode of operation. You may not even realize you're doing it. You tell yourself you're just being honest, just speaking your truth. But honesty without responsibility is cruelty. Cruelty to yourself, because you refuse the mirror you need to see your flaws. Cruelty to others because you treat them as scapegoats rather than collaborators. Once that pattern is entrenched, it takes genuine courage to break it. The courage to admit you're wrong, to ask for feedback, to accept that you control far more of your outcomes than you ever dared to imagine. With that courage, blame remains your constant companion, ensuring you stay exactly where you are, stuck, stagnant, forever sheltered from the only remedy that can set you free. Comfort, when no longer earned through discipline and effort, becomes a subtle, insidious prison. It doesn't arrive with chains or locked doors. It wraps around you like a warm blanket, and slowly it tightens. When you let go of responsibility, you often slip into comfort as a default state, telling yourself you deserve rest, that you've suffered enough, that the struggle isn't worth it. But comfort without purpose is not peace, it's stagnation. You begin to drift. The sharp edges of your ambition dull. The challenges you once pursued feel distant, unnecessary, even absurd. You rationalize the decay as contentment, but deep down, there's a voice reminding you this isn't right, that you were meant for more. People often confuse comfort with happiness, but they are not the same. Happiness is fleeting. True meaning is often found in discomfort. When you pursue something difficult, confront pain, or endure what is necessary, responsibility gives structure to that suffering. It turns chaos into order and transforms adversity into growth. But When you remove that structure, when you reject responsibility, you also reject the opportunity to become stronger. You give yourself over to momentary pleasures, distractions, easy paths that require no real engagement with the deeper problems of your life. And before you realize it, comfort becomes avoidance. You eat when you're not hungry, scroll when you should be thinking, rest when you haven't earned it. It happens gradually. The discipline that once gave your life momentum disappears. You start sleeping in later. You let things pile up. Tasks that once seemed simple now feel overwhelming, not because they've changed, but because you have. The longer you remain in this false comfort, the more your confidence erodes. You lose your edge. And that creates a feedback loop. The less capable you feel, the more you retreat into comfort to avoid facing what you fear you can't handle. Over time, you forget what striving felt like. You forget what pride in your effort even looked like. Worse still, this type of comfort breeds resentment. You start envying those who push forward, who embrace challenge, who stay connected to their purpose. You resent them not because they've wronged you, but because they remind you of the part of yourself you've buried. You may lash out or criticize, not from strength, but from quiet desperation. And every time you do, you reinforce the bars of your self-made prison. Because once you start justifying your inaction, once you build a narrative that excuses your drift into comfort, it becomes harder and harder to return to the path of responsibility. Eventually, you may even fear discomfort altogether. You avoid difficult conversations, physical exertion, emotional vulnerability, anything that disrupts the fragile stability you've built. And the world begins to shrink. You engage less, care less, challenge yourself less. You're no longer truly living. You're merely preserving, not growth, not contribution, but maintenance. Keeping still in a world that demands movement, holding on to ease while everything meaningful slips away. Resentment is one of the ugliest consequences of abandoning responsibility. It rarely arrives all at once. It grows slowly, feeding off frustration, weakness, and the quiet knowledge that you're not doing what you ought to do. When you stop confronting life's challenges, when you shrink from responsibility instead of rising to meet it, you leave a void where your courage should be, and nature abhors a vacuum. That space doesn't stay empty. It fills with bitterness. You begin to notice what others have: success, respect, love, momentum. And instead of being inspired or motivated, you start to feel poisoned by it. Their progress becomes a reminder of your stagnation. Their discipline reflects your avoidance. And because it's easier to resent than to change, that's what you do. Resentment is deceptive. It disguises itself as moral outrage or philosophical disagreement. But underneath, it's usually a deep dissatisfaction with yourself. You know you could have acted, you know you could have tried harder, taken the hit, stood up, or stayed true, but you didn't. And instead of facing that fact, you twist it. You build narratives that make others the villains, those who had it easier, who cheated the system, who didn't really deserve what they have. You create enemies out of people who simply did the hard things you avoided. That's what resentment does. It blinds you. It distorts your perception. It convinces you that the world is unjust, when in reality, you've just failed to live up to your potential. And the more you feed that resentment, the more it takes from you, you start to withdraw. You stop engaging honestly with others. You assume the worst about their motives. You interpret their success as arrogance, their advice as condescension. You become increasingly isolated, not because others have turned away, but because your own shame has convinced you they must be looking down on you. That isolation then reinforces your resentment. You tell yourself you don't need anyone, that you're better off alone, that the world is broken, and you're the only one who sees it clearly. But that's not insight. That's pain talking. A conscience ignored for too long, turning in on itself. What's most dangerous is that resentment doesn't stay contained. It spills into everything: how you talk, how you listen, how you think. It makes you cynical. You stop believing in sincerity, effort, redemption. You mock those who try to improve themselves because it threatens the story you've built. That try-in is pointless, that the game is rigged, that virtue is fake. And with every bitter word, you drift further from the life you could have had, the person you could have become, someone who would have felt pride instead of envy, who would have faced challenges instead of avoiding them, who would have built something instead of tearing others down in your mind. But that person requires courage. It requires you to say, "This is on me," and to bear that weight voluntarily. Without that, resentment wins. And once it takes root, it doesn't let go easily. Chaos is the default state of existence. It's not an opinion. It's a truth rooted in the very fabric of life. Everything, when left unchecked, devolves into disorder. Nature itself tends toward entropy. When you abandon responsibility, when you stop tending to your duties, your life becomes a mirror of that inevitable drift into chaos. Order requires effort, attention, and constant maintenance. But when you let go of responsibility, that effort slips away. The result isn't stillness or peace. It's a deepening disorder that spreads through everything you touch. At first, it might not be obvious. The chaos doesn't immediately appear as catastrophe. It begins quietly. A small inconvenience, a slight disarray, an unmade bed, or an unfinished project. It's easy to dismiss these things as trivial. You tell yourself the mess isn't important, that it doesn't matter if one thing goes undone, that life will go on regardless. But the truth is, every time you ignore responsibility, you introduce a little more disorder into your life. And disorder has a way of multiplying. One unaddressed problem leads to another. And soon your home is cluttered, your mind is cluttered, and you're constantly playing catch-up, trying to put out the fires you've ignored for too long. What happens next is even more insidious. As chaos grows, so does your anxiety. You start to feel overwhelmed, not because the problems are necessarily large, but because they're piling up faster than you can address them. You begin to feel as if you're drowning in a sea of neglected responsibilities, each pulling you deeper. But instead of confronting the mess, you retreat further, hoping it will resolve itself, hoping the chaos will disappear if you ignore it long enough. The more you avoid responsibility, the more power chaos has over you. It takes root in your mind too, not just in your physical space. Your thoughts become scattered. Your plans fragmented. You struggle to keep track of what's important, what's urgent, what truly needs your attention. You forget commitments, miss deadlines, break promises, not because you don't care, but because chaos has taken away your ability to organize, to focus, to act with clarity. In the midst of this growing disarray, your sense of self-control begins to erode. You start feeling helpless, as if the life you're living is being driven by forces outside your control. This feeling of powerlessness reinforces the cycle. You feel incapable of setting things right. And because of that, you avoid making decisions. You avoid taking action. And without action, chaos only expands. Each time you step back from responsibility, you hand more of your life over to the forces of disorder. You become a passenger in your own existence, watching as your life becomes an ever-growing mess you can't seem to fix. But it's not just the external aspects of life that descend into chaos. Your inner world, your emotions, your thoughts, your relationships all become just as unsettled. You stop engaging meaningfully with others. You stop communicating openly. You stop caring about your emotional health. Everything becomes foggy. And in that fog, you lose your direction. You lose your sense of who you are, what you value, and what you want out of life. The more you let things go, the more chaotic your internal world becomes until it's almost impossible to separate yourself from the mess. You are no longer just a person with problems. You are a person whose life is the problem, whose very existence has become a reflection of that inner disorder.